Hello, everyone. Hello, Michael, Jacqueline. I think it's Ryan Connery. Ryan Connery, I believe. Ruderick, and who else is in the class? Kieran. I hope you're well. Of course, you've heard it through emails that my daughter has COVID, and so as a result, because she lives with me, I had to quarantine for 10 days. With that being said, I had to make a decision on how I was going to teach the class for Thursday. That is tomorrow. I'm doing this screencast Omatic this evening so that I can make any edits to it or adjustments to it as I prepare it for you students to look at. Again, with this in mind, if you desire to go through this chapter on your own, you can definitely do so. I will provide the PowerPoint in the Canvas shell as where this video is also found. Also, I will be grading the rough draft term project probably tonight, right, that you sent to me. I want to get that back to you right away so that, or shall I say sooner than later, so that you can begin making your edits and or developing your final edits for your paper. And then Brian Quarles, our instructor, came in and did proctored the exam on Tuesday. So I'll be getting that graded, and hopefully I'll be all set and ready to come back on Tuesday. As mentioned, I have to quarantine for 10 days, and then I have to get a positive test within 72 hours. I have been tested, was tested a couple of days ago, and my test came back negative. So barring any unforeseen COVID issues, I'll be back in the saddle, and we'll be back in regular modality on Tuesday. I am floating the idea of reducing the final exam to only cover the chapters that we get through in the next 3 weeks. We're in chapter 14, 15. So, or should I say we're in week 14 and 15. And so I'm floating that idea. However, I do feel that it is paramount for you to get all that your peers have gotten in the macroeconomics course, that we at least cover, if not in total, in part, chapters 13, 14, and 15. I also want to make a comment. So the last exam that you did on Tuesday, I really watered that exam down. I know I had a couple of comments. I think it was J.O. was commenting to the instructor, well, I bombed that one. J.O., you've got to have more confidence in yourself. You have a 92% in this class, and I think you're smarter than you actually lead on. You study long hours and you apply yourself. So don't sell yourself short. But at any rate, that exam in my mind was doable. I made sure to select multiple choice questions that were not by any stretch intense. All of the items there were items that I had talked about either in class in some aspect. I watered the exam down significantly when it came to chapter 10 and some of the formulatic components. And yes, that problem did have some rigor to it. Well, because it should. Right? I mean, you're a community college learner, and as we've discussed, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So I think just want to make those comments. So today we're going to talk about aggregate demand and supply, and we've identified this several times in previous lectures. To the degree that aggregate supply and demand is truly an extension of supply and demand, right? In terms of the construction of the graph, and more importantly, what the graph actually shows. We're using this theoretical framework, though, today. Again, I have lamented or discussed, shall I say, suggested in class that there are schools of thought. There are ideologies when it comes to economics, and how certain models and theories can impact the decision making, the allocation of goods and services, and the balance within the society. So in this chapter, we're looking at this from a classical view. of economics. And so some of the fundamental tenets that we discussed in the Keynesian theory, where the price level was irrelevant, well, the price level is relevant in the classical approach, right? It is something that, as we identify transitory changes in our society, meaning that as we do things on a day-to-day basis, we are transitioning from point A to point B. And as we transition from point A to point B, certain things are evolving around us, right? So from a transitory perspective, changing perspective, prices of goods and services for us today are very relevant. Now, John Maynard Keynes wasn't saying that prices wasn't relevant, but he was developing a model for economists and those intuitive thinkers in our world to identify the relationship that gross domestic product, that is C plus I plus G plus X of N, the relationship that that has with the income level. Keep in mind now that income is derivative, or shall I say linked, to prices, right? Because if a firm charges, let's just say I bought a PlayStation 5 a couple of months ago. So if a firm charges, let's say $500 for a PlayStation 5, someone is working for Sony, and the price of that good is the reciprocal of that, or shall I say the extension to that is that if $500 are being charged for the good price, then income is being made of $500 for Sony. In microeconomics, we talk a little bit more about how the income component is broken down in terms of a company's need to bear the cost of variable cost elements to produce a product like a PlayStation 5, or the fixed cost elements to produce a PlayStation 5. And in that identifying then the distribution, or that is where that price 500, where it equates to in terms of the income and or the expense that is required to make the good. And of course there's some profit in there, right? Getting back though, don't want to digress. In this case, the classical theory says that price is relevant. Okay, the comparison is, the visual is not to identify consumption and income, but moreover to identify the balance in the society as it applies to the price level and gross domestic product. Okay, so let's sit with that for a moment. See if you can visualize those two positions, the classical view versus the Keynesian view. If you can think about the graph that we developed in the Keynesian, we called it the Keynesian cross. Just want you to think about that for a moment. Okay, so now aggregate supply on its face is similar to the supply curve. So the supply curve then in and of itself is the seller's willingness and ableness to sell goods at varying prices. Aggregate demand represents the decision of buyers and sellers given a particular price level, right? And so the intersection of these two, as we know going back to chapter 3, fundamentally gives us our equilibrium. So 13.1 and 13.2. So as we look at 13.1 and 13.2, we're going to identify then what shifts the demand curve and what shifts the supply curve. Right? We called those determinants previously. Right? But now we're going to look at those items in terms of what we might say transitory effects. Transitory effects or variables within our economy that shift the curve or may propagate, or shall I say may move the points from along the line. Right? So we'll talk about that dimension, the shift factor, or moreover I call them transitory factors, things that shift the demand curve or shift the supply curve, and then items that are specifically related to moving the price level. Now again, our job though is to identify macro equilibrium in the long run and in the short run. So we're going to identify two graphs in this chapter, a long run graph and a short run graph. And then lastly, we may not get to this today, there is what we call a dynamic aggregate demand and supply model. But this is this particular model is, I'm going to say it is granularly developed, meaning that step 1 begets step 2 begets step 3 begets step 4 begets step 5. So when we look at the dynamic model, we're looking at several things affecting our economy, looking at a particular scenario and identifying how the demand curve shifts, how the supply curve shifts as a result of a transitory effect. And so this is the first time that we've really coupled multitudes of things happening at the same time. Right? And so this is what the dynamic model hopes to identify. Sorry for that sound there. So aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So we have now a model, long-run economic growth, and also how real GDP is determined in the short run. Okay, so this is the model that we'll be looking at in a moment. So the new goal is to extend the model of the economy in the short run in order to explain why the following fluctuate or changes. Why does real GDP change? Right? How does this impact employment? And more importantly, what's the impact on the price level? So go back and take a look at that. I'm going to have you read that. I don't know that I articulate that the best for you. So we have now modeled a long-run economic growth and also how real GDP is determined in the short run. I might say that's kind of a loaded sentence. So our new goal, right? Ultimately, what is the impact on real GDP as generated by these fluctuating variables within our society? So the new model, that is, of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, explains in particular now the short-run fluctuations in real GDP and the price level. So keep in mind, I'll differentiate, or shall I say I will discern or identify or explain the short-run model compared to the long-run model. So as we look at this aggregate demand curve, let's take a look at the axes. So on the left axis, we have price level. This is also identified as what we call the GDP deflator. And remember, the GDP deflator is a value that, in essence, relativizes, or shall I say, indexes our price level based upon nominal and real values, right? So the GDP deflator technically is nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. And so this 100 value, as we've indicated in several, or I have indicated in several lectures, this represents our price level as an index number. So you won't see a dollar value on the vertical axis. And then on the horizontal axis, it's real GDP, right? I mean, we can identify it as trillions of dollars because I believe I might have mentioned in class that, on an annual basis, our real GDP is roughly 19 to 20 trillion dollars, right? And so you might see this line as years from maybe year 2002 to year 2003 on this axis, and then maybe identifying that as our income or the availability of goods grows, if the price level is declining, people will buy more goods. If the price level is increasing, people will buy less goods. It's going back to the definition of supply or definition of demand. So according to Hubbard and O'Brien, in the short run, real GDP and the price level are determined by the intersection of aggregate demand curve. So we don't see that GDP level yet, right? Because we would have to align the supply curve to really see where that's happening. So more importantly, aggregate demand curve is a curve that shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. And don't get hung up so much on the term real. Keep in mind that that is saying we want to identify on the actual quantity of goods that are being sold compared to the price level increasing and that value being the leader. So we want to identify how many gallons of gas are actually purchased versus the $5 per gallon that we're paying today. So that's the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. What is the actual goods that the economy is purchasing? And this is a tough position to, again, this is a relative model, right? So we're using this as a thought-provoking theoretical model. And this is the issue with economics at this level, right? Because now that we've gone through some of our more fundamental aspects, or should I say the easier components, now we're asking you to just think outside of the 9 dots, right? So J.O., some of the things that you will see, that Ms. Jacqueline, some of the things that you will see here are more propositions from the author in terms of what will be. And in some cases may be slightly different than what we see in the real world. Like a proposition would say that if a person, works long hours, that they're going to make more and more money, right? That's a proposition. However, that proposition doesn't include that the more hours you work, the more taxes you pay. Okay, so keep in mind that of the relativity of this model, and it is just that it's a snapshot of theoretical compositions, a theoretical composition that is asking us to identify the what if, and also to identify, according to a theorist, this would be true. Once again, now, this is the classical view. Okay, the Keynesian view is slightly different. If you think back, we identified where real GDP equilibrium was on that graph, and it was a completely different construct. Now, and so in this graph, we truly see that this is where we're ascertaining, according to the classical theorists, what we might call short-run aggregate equilibrium. So in the short run, keep in mind now that there's a slight difference here. Let's go back. That here in this right-hand corner, it's literally short-run aggregate supply curve. So this is the new label for this. Remember previously I said it was just AS, but now it's SRAS. So that stands for short-run aggregate supply curve. So in the future, if you were to draw this or you were to show this in your term project and you were using the classical view as a basis, it would be necessary for you to identify it with this particular acronym, right? And then the aggregate demand curve obviously is AD right here. And we've seen this and heard about this several times. Once again, this is very redundant. The short-run aggregate supply curve shows the relationship in the short run between the price level and the quantity of real GDP supplied by firms. And I think that in particular, this is mislabeled right now. I mean, I get it. I wish that this was just a graph that just showed the red line by itself. So keep in mind as you view this, what the short-run aggregate supply curve under the classical theory looks like. So as a repeat, and I want you to take out a piece of paper as you're watching this today, and I want you to draw, if you can do this from my voice, I want you to just draw a graph, two axes, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, and connect them. And then I want you to draw a demand curve in the graph space. And I want you to put AD on the line that's going downward at an angle. Right? And then I want you to on that line, just place C plus I plus G plus X sub N on that line. So I can't show this to you, but I'll show it to you in a moment. What I'm hoping that you're doing is sometimes as you're reading, maybe in the future, economic language, economic terms, economic propositions, that you can immediately graph those propositions, right? So in essence, real GDP has 4 components. So also on your graph, put GDP on the bottom, on the horizontal axis, and then place price level on the vertical axis. So everything on this demand curve that you just drawn is really a byproduct of the consumption component in our society, people buying durable and non-durable goods, the investment piece, that is investing in infrastructure or investing in things that are going to make our productivity better, government, any government purchases. Again, if we were to isolate a government purchase, we might just say implicitly an F-16, right? But we'll take a larger dive into fiscal policy in the next chapter, where we'll expand on all of the things that are included in a government's purchasing basket. It's mind-boggling, right? And so this again is why we had to increase our debt ceiling, because government purchases are generally so large. Consumption, that's us. Investments, that's in part us, but that's also government. Government is exclusively goods and services that are purchased by the government. My paycheck is a government purchase because I work for the county of San Bernardino, which is linked to the state of California, which is linked obviously to the United States as a factor of production, we might call it. And then net exports. So keep in mind that in my class, that in my lecture propositions, it's X first and N second. But in this case, Hubbard is putting the net export or N first and the X second. So government purchases are generally determined by the decision of policy makers. So if we identify just the G, so I'm going to circle the G on my graph. And I'll show you, I don't know if I'll be able to show you what this looks like in the screencast, but I'll identify it in some of my subsequent, in a moment here. So I'm going to circle G on my graph and I'm going to shade it in, right? And then I'm going to actually put an equal sign next to it, and I'm going to write policymakers right next to it. Okay, so we have an aggregate demand curve downward sloping on your note page that you're taking right now. It has on the vertical axis PL, and then I might write 100 or so, at least write 100 on that axis. And then on the horizontal axis, you have GDP, real GDP on the horizontal axis. And then the numbers are relative. You can write 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or you can just leave it by itself. You don't have to write any numbers on that horizontal axis. So this first piece is, as we've now identified the aggregate demand curve sloping downward. I might be able to draw that actually. Let me see if I can. Let's go draw. Okay, let's go here. So this is what we have thus far. I'm doing this with my mouse, not with my finger, so may not be the neatest. So now I'm going to write C. Ooh, that's a large C. I, G. Again, I'm doing this with my mouse. And then X sub N. Now I'm going to circle the G. I get it, Jacqueline. I get that looks like a 6 or something. That is G. And then I'm going to go here, policymakers. Okay. So now as we look at this line, one of the things that's interesting is these next three slides are going to identify, more importantly, why this aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Why does it slope down like that? What makes it so? I mean, previously we said that the downward sloping component was based upon the fact that as prices of goods and services go down, that people would buy more. So prices go down, people will buy more. But now under this short-run classical theory, we're identifying that there are three effects that impact buyers' ability to do things, right? And so these effects are the reasons for the downward sloping line. So this is an addition. I mean, if you leave this class, you go, well, I know you're going to know what demand is. That is the relationship that price and quantities have under a buyer's consideration. Or more importantly, as buyers see the world as it applies to goods. As price drops, theoretically, buyers will buy more. Once again, as I mentioned, the proposition component, that's not always going to be the case. If you've struggled if you've had any financial hardship in your life, as I have, just because prices drop doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to buy more. But it's a general rule, right? So we're using this model as a general rule. That is this model here on the left. Okay? And so I don't know, if I were you, I might just write classical theory. I'm not going to do it with my mouse because it would take me forever. Classical theory. Okay? And this is a short run model, right? Very important to distinguish between the short run model and the long run model. Now, getting back, so the reason for this line going down, as according to the theorists, and not Hubbard or O'Brien. I mean, this is something that has been around for quite some time, at least 100 years, or moreover, I would say at least 50 or 60 years, as economists have studied the world. Earlier economists may not have looked at this the way we see it today because of the primitive nature. I shouldn't say primitive, but because of when we were talking about being in the early 1900s, a government was relevant, but it wasn't as relevant as it is today, right? I mean, meaning that the level of importance may not have been as direct, right? And this may have been primarily because our world hadn't evolved and wars hadn't occurred and alliances with other countries, or should I say the disharmony between maybe Russia and America had not been identified. I digress a bit, but my point is that this proposition is a last 100 years developed. So when I'm gone, right, and in the next 100 years after I'm gone, economists may see the world differently, right? And so thus we'll have different theories. So getting back, so the household consumption is most strongly determined. And again, we're talking about the effects. This is effect number one. Let's go back here. So we took from this verbiage, right? I'm not sure why that's happening. We took from this, we took from this verbiage and we developed a graph that looks like that. Okay? It's kind of janky, my daughter would say, but it is relative. Okay, so now based on this, we're saying then that if people, the impact that wealth has on the aggregate demand curve is significant. According to theorists, I won't say Hubbard and O'Brien because they're regurgitating what other theorists have said, household consumption is the most strongly determined by income, but it is also affected by wealth. So this downward sloping line is affected by the fact that if people are wealthier, more goods and services can be purchased. If people are less wealthy, less goods and services are purchased. That is, some household wealth is held in what we might deem nominal assets. So as price levels rise, the real value of household wealth declines. This results in less consumption. This is a prime example, as I mentioned earlier, that you can be wealthy as all get out, but if the price of goods and services, the price of gas is $5, then it's going to impact your overall wealth. That is, the real value of household wealth declines as price levels rise. Okay. Thus, this will also result in less consumption. Think about that for a moment. So again, this effect. So I might also now come in here, if I were to do this, if I were doing notes, now I'm going to say wealth effect. Let's see. I'll have to do that with my mouse. Wealth effect. And I got two more effects that I'm going to align here. I know it looks like we, but it really means wealth effect. Number 2, the interest rate effect. Again, how a change in the price level affects investments. And let me go back here too, because I think I may have missed a little bit of this discussion here to say that if this item moves, right, the price level moves, then the wealth effect is going to be impacted. If the price goes up, wealth effect is less. If the price goes down, wealth effect is more. Moreover, if the price goes up, when prices rise, households and firms need more money to finance buying and selling. So households and firms borrow and withdraw funds from banks and sell financial assets such as bonds in order to have more funds available. So I want to be very careful to say, okay, bonds is a governmental action. You and I don't sell bonds. This is related to government. However, corporations will sell bonds, but not you and I. Okay? We might sell bonds when we get married because we're bonded to someone. And that bond could impact our aggregate demand either for more or less. But bonds are a government factor or a government activity. So in order to have more funds available, so this increases in demand, this increase in demand for money causes the price of holding money to rise, discouraging firms from investment. So let's go back. So now over here, we're going to say the reason for this downward sloping aggregate demand curve is because the interest effect. If interest rates go down, people buy more. If interest rates go up, people buy less from the standpoint of borrowing money. This is still AD right here. So if you look at this, we've identified two main components of this theory. That is, the aggregate demand curve is a representation of C plus I plus G plus X sub N, but it also is propagated or developed and or shaped because of the wealth effect and the interest rate effect. The international trade effect, the third effect. This is again how price level affects net exports. When U.S. price levels rise, U.S. exporters become more expensive and imports become relatively cheaper. Meaning, if prices rise in America, typically individuals will buy more goods from international, meaning imports become relatively cheaper. I'll read that one more time. When the U.S. price level rises, prices go up. U.S. exports become more expensive. So if they're more expensive, then that means that in America, we're going to buy less of those goods. Thus, if that's the case, imports become relatively cheaper. We buy more goods from China. We go to Walmart more often. So fewer exports and more imports means net exports fall. And if net exports fall, then that means that the aggregate demand in terms of our goods and services that are sold in America are going to be less. The implication, higher price level leads to lower net exports. So all three effects show how price levels lead to lower values of the components of real GDP. So now let's go back. So now we're going to say international trade. Oops. I don't have a mouse on my computer at home. In the office here. Effect. International effect. Now I would probably go ahead and clean this up if I were you, but I would take just a moment to draw this in front of you on the page that you have. Make sure you duplicate this in your own writing. So you should have two graphs. And again, on this here, this axis here, that's just an axis label. This will be there. Price level is going to go there. And then gross domestic product is going to go right underneath there. Right? I should have done that with a different pen. Okay, I'll let you finish that. All right. So now that we know the components of aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X sub N, and now we also know why, according to classical theorists, the demand curve slopes downward. The three effects, again, truly there's another effect that Hubbard and O'Brien does not consider, and it's called the purchasing power effect. Right? So the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, the international trade effect, and the purchasing power effect, meaning if the price level goes down, people can purchase more. If the price level goes up, people can purchase less. Purchasing power effect. Okay? But that is not included in this particular textbook. So each of these three effects show higher price levels leading to lower values of gross domestic product. This establishes the aggregate demand curve in and of itself. So shifts in the aggregate demand curve versus movements. Okay, now we're getting into the good parts of this. So a movement along the AD curve will occur when the price level changes by itself. And the changes in prices is not caused by a component of real GDP changing. Now let's just say on its face, if I were doing this and I were reading this, I would say the movement along the demand curve will occur when the price level changes. And the change in price is not caused by components of real GDP. That's a real tough one. So I'm going to go ahead here. I'm going to go back to my pen. Where's my pen? Let's go draw. Oops. Draw. And I'm going to highlight this. Not caused by a component of real GDP. And this really dilutes this first premise statement. In my mind, the main key is that movements are generated, draw, movements along the curve are a byproduct of changing prices, period. Right? So this is a situation where we're saying in and of itself, oh, okay, oh, I like this. This is sweet. So let's go demand. Price level goes down. Movement from here to here. Not a shift, but a movement. That's what they're saying in that sentence. A shift of aggregate demand curve will occur when some components of real GDP changes. Some component of real GDP. Aha. So now, this shift is brought about changes in real GDP. And keep in mind that we've already identified that G is a big part of this demand curve. C is a big part. Investments are a big part. And of course, net exports are a big part. Right? So a shift to the right or a shift to the left. Okay? Let me go back and identify what I did here. So I wanted to link a movement along the aggregate demand curve is brought about by changes in prices. That's why those two lines are the same. I said to be cautionary, or shall I say, consider this, but don't factor it into your memory domain, that when it says not caused by a component of real GDP. That's just more information than we really need right now. Remember, a model is only as good if you can isolate things that are tangible and viewable. Use those, right? But other elements could confuse and bring about a more ambiguous end result. And I think that this last sentence does that, right? And then a shift in aggregate demand curve will occur when some components of real GDP changes. And so these components are all of these things. Oops. Oh, I messed that up. All right. I messed that up really badly. But I hope if you watched this video, you saw me. You can kind of correlate that. Let's go with draw. How do I erase it? Get this out of here. Okay. All right. Let's just scroll back over here. And it's red. Remember now, this would be labeled AD1. And then this is AD2. So as a prime example, that is variables that shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And we talked, and I spoke specifically earlier about government policy. An increase in interest rates, right, will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Higher interest rates raise the cost to households and firms of borrowing, reducing consumption and investment spending. Now think about that. All right. And the one thing that we don't see here, which if I could draw it, I'm just going to draw it on here now, is we really should add the supply curve over the top of that. Because then what happens is you're able to see, obviously, old hat. This is long, short run. Oops. No, I don't like the way that's coming out. Let's erase that. So this is the supply curve. I'm just going to put AS. So notice what happens to the equilibrium. Equilibrium was here. Now it's down here. All right. So interest rates, and you will hear this, the federal government, or shall I say the Federal Reserve Bank, is going to increase rates because inflation is so high. They do that to slow the level of inflation. If we had an arrow pointing this way, that would be inflation. Meaning if the demand curve had moved from here, from this point to this point, that's inflation. This is disinflation. Right? Prices going down. So keep in mind, when mortgage interest rates go up, the plan for the Federal Reserve Bank is to slow the economy. If mortgage interest rates go up, then you can bet that the regular prime rate of interest rate is going to go up, meaning us borrowing to buy cars, borrowing money to buy homes, or more importantly, us borrowing money to go on vacations. It's all impacted by the interest rate increase. Okay. Interest rate, I want to see, I drew this M here. Monetary, mortgage, right? So this M, make sure you qualify in your notes that this means mortgage interest rates. Mortgage interest rates, that's what this M means. So a government policy change could shift aggregate demand. The big ticket is could, right? Remember we learned back in the early days of economics class that there's a normative statement and a positive statement. So in effect, you could view this as a normative, a value judgment of an economist, right? But as a student, we're removing the could. We're saying government policy change will shift aggregate demand, right? Now, if we're sitting having coffee, you and I could we could discuss or debate whether or not a demand curve will shift or not. So there's two categories of government policies here. I mentioned earlier mortgage interest, monetary policy. We'll talk about this next week. The actions of the Federal Reserve. You've heard me mention Federal Reserve several times. Jerome Powell, I believe, is our Federal Reserve Chairman. And this is what they will take actions to manage the money supply and the interest rates to pursue macroeconomic policy objectives. Now, these objectives may not always work out. But this is where the classical theory is incorporating the Federal Reserve Bank, whereas John Maynard Keynes did not consider that in his Keynesian cross. But it's fair. He was looking at some somewhat different dimensions of the economy. So if the Federal Reserve causes interest rates to rise, investments, spending will fall, causing rates to fall. Now, that is, if it causes interest rates to fall, investment spending will rise. So there's two pieces here. First of all, if Fed causes interest rates to rise, then investment spending will fall. That's the A proposition. And then B, if it causes interest rates to fall, then investments to rise. And so that's the B proposition that's incorporated in this slide. So there's an A proposition and a B proposition. I might draw it here. Here's the A proposition. And then here's the B proposition. Okay, so there's two situations, two scenarios that are considered here. More importantly, we want to identify that this interest rate is a determinant or a shift factor. Shift factor. Okay, either one way or the other. Further, government purchases. Okay. That is, government purchases are a component of aggregate demand. So the more governments purchase, the greater demand is. The less governments purchase, the less demand will be. Keep in mind, this is shift factor. Let's go back over here. This is shift factor number 1. Shift factor number 2 for aggregate demand, that is. Shift factor number 3. If income taxes, personal income taxes or business taxes, if they rise, then it will be a shift to the left. If they fall, it's a shift to the right. Okay? Personal income taxes or business taxes, going up or going down. So we have to look at both sides of the coin. If taxes go up, demand shifts back to the left. If taxes go down, demand shifts back to the right. That is, consumption spending falls when personal taxes rise, and investment falls when business taxes rise. Okay, so consumption here. Draw. First component. And then second, spending falls when personal tax rise. And then investments. But if we go back to where we started, now we're actually identifying the changes in these items. Delta means change. These are the things, the changes that are impacting the shift of the curve. Delta, that's a delta sign. I know it kind of looks a little weird. Stands for change. Okay, so you can see now the relationship, or moreover, you can see the connection that we're making. All right. Secondly, fiscal policy changes in federal taxes and purchases that are intended to achieve macroeconomic objectives. So these are the fiscal policy components: taxes and government purchases. Increases or decreases in personal income taxes affects disposable income and hence consumption. So this is really redundant. This is saying exactly what we've seen here. They're just saying it again here. Now keep in mind, we're at 51 minutes and I'm going to stop for today's lecture. And we've only gone through 13 of the 56 slides that are in this chapter. I may want to encourage you then, moving forward, as you read your chapter, to also spend about an hour, and you might even have to spend like an hour every other day going over the PowerPoints. But it's not that significant, because I this year I let you students use notes, but that holistic, that extant review, it takes time. Okay, but again, that's why I'm your professor and I can walk you through these items. So when I see you next Tuesday, I'm going to expect that you would have gone over all of the items that will shift the demand curve to the right or the left, which would be slide 14, slide 15, and then we'll start on slide 19 when I see you next Tuesday. Okay, so make sure that you go over, if I go back here, go over slide 14, 15, and 16. Before you leave your computer right now, do this now. For the next 10 minutes. Okay, so that when I see you next week, we can talk a little bit more about this. But this is critically important because of the remaining chapters that we have to discuss. And then we'll start on 19. We'll start here next time. And so I'm going to change design here. Let's see if I have some. I'm going to change this up for this one right here. See if they give me any ideas. I like that. So that's where we're going to start next time. Save as. Let's go ahead and put this in somewhere where I can find it. Put it in downloads. We're going to call this Day 2 COVID Return. All right, please. Thank you so much for your time today. Again, I will grade your term projects here in the next couple of hours. That is, I'll grade them by Friday. Let's put it that way. I don't want to tell you I'll grade them in a couple of hours and then you'll be looking for them before the night's over, because I am going to take a break now with my family. And then, but this is our lecture effectively. In order to earn points for the lecture today, I'm going to place a couple of questions in the Canvas shell that you'll have to answer related to what we just talked about. And then that will show me that you actually watched this. And there is going to be a timestamp on the discussion board, right? So it has to be done by 2:10. That is tomorrow, regarding just a couple of questions on this lecture. And I'll count that as participation, not extra credit, participation for today. All right. And again, this is for lecture for December 2nd, 2021. Professor is out because of COVID protocols, and this only applies to fall 2021. All right, thank you, students. Have a great day, and we'll see you next Tuesday.